For the last few months, a handful of people, me included, have been using the phrase civil war when talking about what seems to be unfolding right now in the United States of America. Those comments have often been dismissed as fantastical, but now, separate to the partisans, voices that are more difficult to ignore are also making themselves heard. Now, nothing is inevitable, but there is plenty to be concerned about, and that's before you even get into the fact that some of the main protagonists, such as Trump himself and his key supporters, are starting to directly flag the possibilities of political violence to come. We'll get into that as well, so let's dive straight in. It's only something like 3 or 4 weeks ago that I last discussed this topic. I'd rather hoped that it would be it for the time being, and a few people have scolded me in the past for even mentioning it, although that's normal for this channel, never knowingly underscolded, that's me. On Twitter, or X or whatever, it's become a thing to dismiss any such talk as advocacy. Tim Pool and Steve Bannon talk about it, so the line goes they must be calling for it, and hence respectable people don't mention it at all because to do so might make it more likely to happen. Now, obviously, if simply mentioning the possibility of something makes that thing more likely to happen, you must be a lot closer to it than you're admitting. Because in normal times, people intoning a coming civil war would simply paint themselves as cranks and nutters and would promptly be ignored and ridiculed by everyone. In most cases, identifying a looming problem is as much a device to encourage people to avoid that problem as it is to make it happen. I mean, that never used to be a controversial concept, but right now, everything is stupid, so whatever logic worked before can't be taken for granted today. In any case, the most recent period, a lot more people have now started talking openly about the possibility. Commentators on both political sides and also from some expert analysts. So, for instance, Barbara F. Walter, a CIA advisor, but perhaps more pertinently the author of the book How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them. She wrote this: "No one wants to believe that their beloved democracy is in decline or headed towards war. But if you were an analyst in a foreign country looking at events in America, the same way you'd look at events in Ukraine or Ivory Coast or Venezuela, you would go down a checklist assessing each of the conditions that make civil war likely, and what you would find is that the United States, a democracy founded more than 2 centuries ago, has entered very dangerous territory." In addition to her, billionaire investor Ray Dalio published a long article this week on the business social media website LinkedIn. Now, Dalio's research on the cycles of great powers through history has been very influential on me and on some of the things that I say on this channel. It's his book on all that, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, and his description of how internal conflict at some level is part and parcel of the fall of empires, that turned my mind towards thinking that this could be where the US was going in the first place. So I was kind of interested to see what he had to say on this specific question, because if I jumped to erroneous conclusions based on an imperfect understanding of what he'd laid out in his framework, entirely possible, then I expected my mistake would be exposed in his own piece. And yes, I think it's always good to seek out deliberately things that you believe might challenge your preconceptions. That's something that has led me to change my mind on certain topics a number of times, through my lifetime at least. That's not what happened this time. Dalio wrote this about what he sees as universal truths about order and disorder. "I believe that it is true for all people in all collective activities, sport, organisations, governments, etc., that if A. there is no acceptable way to agree on what is probably true, e.g. there's no equivalent of instant replay in a sport, and B, both sides don't trust the referees or judges because they believe that they are under the influence of the other side, and C, rather than judgments being made and enforced according to the rule book, they are made and enforced by the opinions of people that make up an unruly crowd. Then chaos and chaotic fighting will follow. I think it's hard not to identify that as a relatively accurate description of what's happening in the US political space right now. In pressing his case, Dalio asked 5 questions. Well, let's try them out here. 1. Do you trust most politicians in government to render fair judgments of other politicians and non-politicians? My answer to that, and Ray Dalio's, is a strong no. Right now, tribal loyalties are directing the political process more than they should. Now, tribal loyalties have always been part of politics, of course. But for example, right now, congressional investigations are pretty much purely attacks on opponents, not attempts to uphold mutually agreed standards. Even within normal partisan politics, that has not been the norm. Sometimes the visible exception, yes, but not the norm. 2. Do you believe that most Americans trust most politicians to render fair judgments of other politicians and non-politicians? Slightly tougher to call. Polls show that substantial minorities of distrust, but various polls show that the numbers have been growing sharply over the last couple of years. And Dalio added that when he first produced his book on the changing world order, he personally estimated the odds of a civil war in the US as about 1 in 3. In his article, he says, I now estimate it a bit over 1 in 2. In other words, more likely than not. 3. Do you think that most of those in the media are painting accurate pictures? I answer no to that, and Ray Dalio agrees. Now, he's not a political activist on either side, remember. It's fairly normal for the activist to decry the bias of the media, but he says that loss of trust in information sources is typical throughout history at this stage of conflict. Not knowing what is true because of distortions in the media and propaganda increases as people become more polarized, emotional, and politically motivated. 4. Do you think most Americans think most of those in the media are painting accurate pictures? Now, obviously I can't mind read most Americans, but the polls certainly say not, and I have no particular reason to disbelieve them. For example, one recent Gallup poll suggested that only 7% of adults have a great deal of trust in the media. Dalio notes this is not likely to improve between now and 2025, which he predicts will be, quote, a crazy period. I'm thinking that's one of the safest predictions I've seen so far this year. And he quoted his book, and I think it's worth repeating this quote in full. In stage 5 of conflict, those who are fighting typically work with those in the media to manipulate people's emotions to gain support and to destroy the opposition. In other words, media folks of the left join with others of the left, media folks of the right join with others of the right in the dirty fight. The media goes wild like vigilantes. People are commonly attacked and essentially tried and found guilty in the media, and they have their lives ruined without a judge and jury. During times of great wealth gaps and populist thinking, stories that bring down elites are popular and lucrative, especially those that bring down left-leaning elites in right-leaning media outlets and those that bring down right-leaning elites in left-leaning media outlets. The historical version is the rise of trial by opinions over trials by law. Modern version of that would include words like cancel culture. Not unique to the US at the moment, of course, but few other places are so far gone. Dalio finishes by saying that with the growing number of fights in which there is no respect for the rules, in which each side will seek to win at all costs, that will lead to some form of civil war. He does not suggest, and I'm pretty sure I don't suggest, that this turns early into anything that looks like the First Civil War, with loyalties divided by territory, with military forces picking sides, organised warfare being carried out between them. Personally, I imagine it starts with something like the situation we had in the UK with Northern Ireland for many years, where there are small organised wings on both sides, condemned of course by mainstream politicians, albeit some of them might be nudging and winking while doing so, carrying out attacks and terrorist outrages, and various events that lead to many other instances of disorganised violence, riots, lone wolf incidents and the like. According to Reuters, the last few years have seen the biggest rise already in political violence since the 1970s. In the 1970s, it was mostly actions by left-wing inspired activists against property. But the recent increase is more focused on violence against people. Starting in 2016, when, you may recall, we saw various protests that led to rioting, mostly by campaign groups against Trump or on issues like Black Lives Matter, and then, since Trump was removed from office, from right-wing actors, which shouldn't be a huge surprise, I guess. The side that feels most aggrieved by the current state of play is more likely to see individuals from within its ranks cross the line. The thing that moves that from a volatile situation, where a few individuals cross a line, to an institutional breakdown, is how much the aberrations are condemned or alternatively tacitly supported by mainstream political figures and institutions. And on that score right now, it's not looking entirely great. And we will come to that in just a second. First, if you value the videos I do on this channel, please consider supporting it on Patreon. I have not been pushing that support in recent months, and levels of support there have declined as a result. Not entirely surprisingly. If you think it's important to have independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content on some of these crucial issues for the future, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. When asked about the prospects of civil war, Trump hasn't exactly gone out of his way to calm things down. Speaking to Tucker Carlson last week, he answered a question on the subject, saying this: "There's a level of passion that I've never seen. There's a level of hatred that I've never seen. That's probably a bad combination." Others of his supporters, such as Marjorie Taylor Greene, Sarah Palin, have called explicitly for either succession of red states or for civil war if Trump is tried and found guilty. Georgia State Representative Colton Moore called on the state legislature there to intervene in the case being brought by Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis, or else he might have to reluctantly join with those drawing their rifles. Nobody on the Democrat side is currently talking exactly like that, but they are blithely going ahead with a logic that kind of leads to the same place. In September last year, Biden spoke at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where he said, "Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans represent an extremism that threatens the very foundations of our republic," which is the sort of framing that is then wielded to justify the fact that Biden will be trying soon to win an election against an opponent being prosecuted by the government that he leads. Every step towards the precipice, people believe, is clearly and obviously the right step. You'll see some of them reflected in the comments below. Largely because they have zero empathy with how people see the world on the other side, and they don't much care. Because they see themselves as self-evidently right, the other side as self-evidently wrong about everything. On the plus side, there is no evidence that there are competent mobilizing networks on either side that would be able to create a coherent and attractive to supporters force when events get triggered. If you look at the history of such events, they are usually led by charismatic, competent leaders. Charismatic Trump undoubtedly is, but his tendency to buffoonery, his inability to attract competent people, and his tendency to fire them if he accidentally does, makes him a less potent threat than might be the case. Now, of course, once you stick him in jail and take him out of active participation, make him a martyr, you create a space for someone else to fill in his name. But we don't know who that would be right now. Most likely the US would enter a period of what might be described as a cold civil war. As I said before, some outbreaks of disorganised angry violence, relatively easily dealt with, some rogue groups, lone wolf individuals, secretive small cabals that would seek to rally more and more support to their cause. In other words, the jailing of Trump and maybe the removal of Trump from some state ballots, as some are trying to achieve under the excuse of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, these might well light the blue touch paper to accelerate the downward spiral. But a second civil war, in whatever form it eventually takes, probably doesn't start on day one. The machinery isn't there, the leadership isn't there, the will isn't there, not yet. Which means there's still time for politicians who haven't quite forgotten what the centre ground looks like to act to try to prevent the worst of the downward slide. But I don't know who would lead that charge. Do you? Add your thoughts in the comment section below if you do. I know some of the viewers of this channel don't want to hear about civil war. I mean, let's face it, who does? And I'm sorry about that, but, really, I doubt you have much choice. It is going to be much talked about by a growing circle of increasingly mainstream people, as well as independents, over the coming year. Because this is, whether you like it or not, a dangerous moment for the democratic system of the republic that is the United States. And that dangerous moment won't be passed successfully by ignoring the dangers that are right in front of it.